Now, the chances are people will have heard about The Imposter, Bart, and the reviews have been astonishing. You must be extremely gratified to have it out there and to be getting the reviews that you have. Tell us about, we know he's an imposter. We know he's a con man because the title of the film. Just tell us about this guy and this story and how you found it.
Yeah, it's hard to know how much to talk about without giving some of the revelations, which I think probably are best left for the audience to discover away. But essentially, the story really begins in 1994 when a young 13-year-old boy called Nicholas Barkley disappears without a trace from San Antonio in Texas. And nothing is heard from him for the best part of 4 years until the family receive a phone call in October of 97 saying that he'd been reported found in an orphanage in a tiny village in the south of Spain, which is thousands of miles away. And this family had never left Texas, let alone the United States. And of course, that phone call then triggers the whole machinery of, the State Department, the US Embassy, the FBI, and of course the family to go and recover the missing boy. And of course, as the title suggests, it's not their son. In fact, it is a 23-year-old Frenchman who is a serial, who's had a kind of history of impersonating damaged kids for what seemed to be the ends of getting access to social services. And what he used to do was basically travel throughout Europe pretending to be an orphan in order to stay for weeks and months, often years, in children's centres. And on this particular occasion, he had been he was staying in this children's centre in Spain, and someone had smelt a rat and said, if you don't give us definitive information as to your identity and nationality, we're going to take you to the police and we're going to have you fingerprinted. And at that point, searching for a kind of way out, he decided to go in search of a real identity which he could pass himself off as. And he found, he contacted the Missing Children's Centre, describing himself effectively, and they came up with what they believed was a match, and it was the missing kid from Texas. And I don't know whether, I think, as you'll see in the film, I'm not sure that was his, I don't even know what he thought he was up to at that point, but he was about to unleash this lie that spiraled so wildly out of his control to the point that not only did the family come to retrieve him, but he didn't only fool the Spanish authorities, the American embassy, he then fooled the boy's family into thinking that this was their son. And so he was returned to Texas to begin a new life as a 16-year-old.
Now, the question which I know you asked yourself right at the very beginning of making the film, and which everyone will ask themselves all the way throughout your film, is how is it possible for, I think I've got for a 23-year-old French Algerian with dark hair and brown eyes to pass himself off to sister and mother and other members of the family as a 16-year-old white, blonde, blue-eyed Texan? At no stage, a point which your imposter makes in the pieces that he has recorded for you, does he look, he's got nothing to base his impersonation on. And I'm not sure whether, maybe you do know, but it's a question at the heart of this film, isn't it? How is it possible for the family, never mind the State Department, never mind the police or anyone else, but the mother and the sister to think, yes, this is him?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is a question right at the heart of the film. And I guess on one level it kind of, it throws up questions which are as much about self-deception as there are about deception, really. Having said that, I think, this, before you go into the film, I think that's the thing that you just think, hang on a minute, if my son disappeared age 13 and returned 3.5 years later with different colouring, different facial, features essentially, and a really thick French accent, there's no way I'd fall for it. But at the same time, I don't think that's the thing that you're screaming at the screen when you watch this film. I think partly because he is an incredibly skilled manipulator and deceiver, He covered himself up. He dyed his hair blonde. He got tattoos put on him that the missing boy had at the time of his disappearance. He went a long way to make the deception work. But then again, I suppose it throws up this question of what are we as human beings capable of believing if it's something that we desperately need to be true. And then, of course, there are other revelations which appear further down in the film, which I probably wouldn't go into now, but which also throw up other bigger, more alarming questions.
Yes. Which give you possibly another angle to go down if you're trying to answer this basic question as to why they would have taken him in. James, what do you think?
We've had some great documentaries in the last few years that have relied very heavily on archive footage. I mean, going back to last year in Senna, of course, all archive footage. When you're making this film, there are moments that you have to reconstruct because you don't have archive footage of them. I know you don't like to think of them as sort of traditional reenactments. Can you tell us a little bit about how you filmed those moments and reconstructed things that you didn't actually have footage for?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really good question. I wouldn't call them reconstructions really, because I think, or reenactment, because I think that implies, well, probably makes you think of Crime Watch as much as anything, but it also implies you've got this kind of forensic reconstruction of events that we know must have happened. And what this film really is about the elusiveness of truth in some ways. That we have a variety of, I suppose, rather unreliable witnesses in a way. And it became quite clear to me earlier on in the film that I wasn't going to find this very neat sort of objective version of the truth. I wasn't going to find an answer to how this all happened. And actually that wasn't necessarily what the film was going to be about. Really, I was confronted with 4 or 5 conflicting versions of the truth. And so I would go from one interview one day, I'd literally would come away from an interview with a family member, let's say, completely convinced I understood what had happened in this situation. And the next day I'd sit down with the member of, the FBI, and I would come away equally convinced of the completely opposite conclusion. And so as a documentary maker, that's a very sort of bewildering thing. And it felt very important that the audience would go on the way that, for me, the more truthful way of telling this was actually to put you as an audience member right inside this experience. So you go on everyone's journey with them. You know the information that they are privy to. All of them, the FBI are desperately trying to figure out who this person is. The family want their brother back. He wants a family that he's never had, and we're weirdly encouraged to sort of sympathise or not with all of the people. And to your point about reconstruction, we didn't have the kind of archive that Man on Wire had, or Senna, or any of that. There is some amazing archive in the film, but also and this being visual, this being cinema, and it is intended to be a movie that plays like a movie. I felt we had to find a way of recreating that past. And I think if a great storyteller tells you a great story, you have this very visual experience. If you were listening to the film on the radio play out, you would have a kind of movie that plays in your head. And it was that I wanted to recreate, really. And there's a lot of devices in those dramatizations which are supposed to function as a shorthand to tell you whose part of the story you're inhabiting. So you go in either as a point of view shot, it turns into an over the shoulder shot, and the idea is that it plays with this, without trying to get too kind of academic about it, but it plays with this idea of subjectivity, that you're inside someone's memory rather than the reality of what must have happened.
It's 7 minutes to 3. Bart Layton is our guest, talking about his acclaimed documentary, The Imposter. Let's play you a clip.
Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Lorraine speaking. How may I help you?
We have a kid in shelters, certainly is American, who is about 14, 15 years old. The problem is we don't know who he is, we don't know.
I described
where he
myself.
comes from.
Every details I gave was details that I know that I could handle. I wanted to be vague enough for her to look at many different things. I wanted her to have many possibilities.
Let me just take a look here.
I got maybe something, she said, maybe, we got a kid from San Antonio missing since June 13, 1994. His name is Nicholas Barclay. I said, could you send me a fax of what he looked like? In my head, I was just a police officer with Nicholas Barclay next to me, trying to confirm his identity, and like any other policeman would do. Let's see if it's him. I thought, let's see if it's him.
That is Frédéric Bourdin, who is the imposter. He made me feel quite uncomfortable, which is presumably exactly the way he should make me feel. But he kind of is a narrator for certainly the first section of the film, and then you quickly realise that in terms of the unreliable narrator, he is the ultimate. I mean, and then you think, well, I'm not sure I can believe anything that he's telling me. Were you the person who did the interviews? And the filming? What did you think you could believe him?
Well, I think that's also something that's really kind of at the heart of the film, because I certainly, when I met him and sat down with him, I realised that the more he told me about what he'd done, knowing that he'd done this despicable thing, the more I was finding myself slightly sold on some of this quite weird logic. He tells you about his past, about the fact that he never had a childhood, and that it was stolen from him, that he was, his family never loved him. He was the illegitimate child of a Algerian, born to a grandfather who was incredibly, fascist. So the idea of having a half Algerian grandson would have been horrific to him. And so what he says is, I had the wrong identity before I even showed up. And you start to buy into that. And also, he sort of says things like, they were a family who'd lost a kid, and I was a kid who'd lost a family. And at the moment you find yourself buying that logic, you realise, or I realised, that actually possibly I was becoming sucked into, a victim of the manipulation or the con, for want of a better word. And then I wondered whether actually one of the really interesting ways of telling this story is actually to put the audience on the receiving end of him. So that he speaks down the lens and he talks to you, and as you say, he is the narrator for a large swathe of the film, but right from the start that he's not to be trusted. He tells you that what he does, how he does it, you kind of know that this is the consummate unreliable witness in many ways. Yet some people have found him incredibly charming, incredibly compelling. I think I certainly found him to be disarming at times, and I think one of the things that makes this possibly different from most documentaries you might have seen is that you're not at arm's length from all of these people in it. You are kind of almost directly in contact with them.
Was there at any point where you thought of having more of an authored documentary, so that we would have a voice saying, an audible voice saying, you caused all this pain, you've upset this family, just putting him sort of Paxman-esque on the spot?
No, I didn't really feel like that was the kind of film that I wanted to make, because I felt that the thing that you put it really brilliantly at the beginning. The thing that you cannot understand is how this could have come about. You just can't get it. How can a family confuse French Algerian? And as you just heard on the clip, he's got a thick French accent, and that's after he did a long time in American jail. So
and there's a bit in your film where after about an hour, the sister says, once it had all been explained to her that it was, what the truth was, she says, how could I have been so stupid?
Yeah.
And the five of us in the screen, yes, that's what we've been thinking for the whole of the film.
Possibly, but at the same time, I think you wonder whether they, were they just desperate to believe something that against all the evidence? And I guess, for me, the reason I didn't want to construct that kind of a film, because I thought the most interesting way of doing this is actually for you to listen to all of those people tell you their version of the story. And you're the person that has to navigate that. And you have to make your own mind up. And actually, I think all of those things which you talk about him being confronted with what he did, are all in the film. And not necessarily, I don't think it's my voice that needed to do that. I think, hopefully it credits the audience with a great deal of intelligence and treats them with respect. Really.
I think that everyone who goes to see this film will think, wow, this is an extraordinary story which you've told. And then into this extraordinary story, just when you think it can't get any stranger, your private detective comes along, who, if the cliche is central casting, but Charlie Parker is his name. He's a huge guy. He looks exactly like you want a private detective to look, and he was a god. I mean, explain the character. Jim.
Well, it is exactly the kind of story. The whole story is exactly the kind of thing you would read and go, "Wow, this sounds like a movie." You know, all of it does sound like a movie, and I'm interested in knowing. In terms of, I mean, we mentioned right at the top about the revelations that happened during the film that we don't want to talk about too much, but how much did you know going into the film, and how much did you experience these revelations whilst you were making the movie? How much did you learn during the making of the film?
And we got 1 minute left.
Sure. I mean, I don't think anything can really prepare you for actually, I'd read a lot about it, but nothing really can prepare you for when you sit down with that person and they tell you the story. And it is just so bewildering, and loads of people have asked, why didn't you make it as a straight fictional version, based on a true story? And the simple answer is that if you read it as a screenplay or a work of fiction, it would be too far fetched. And characters like Charlie Parker, in fact, after one of the screenings at Sundance where the film premiered, someone put up their hand and said, I'm interested to know if this is based on a true story. And I was like, hang on a minute, you just watched the documentary. It is, there are things in it, and it's very much, it's shot by a director of photography who's done big movies. It's edited by a guy who's done Bruce Willis films. It's intended to look and feel like a proper movie, but certainly it is a documentary. I mean,
Bart, we're out of time. I appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
You got a good distribution deal in one word?
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, okay. Bart Layton, The Imposter is his film. Bart, thank you very much indeed. This is 5 Live Headlines coming next.